Hello, hello! Welcome to another episode of History in the Dark. I am your host, Darkness the Curse. And before we begin, as always, thank you so much to my generous patrons, my British rail critics, and of course my underwater train finders. You are the reason why this content remains sad. It's just sad. And today, we are going to discuss the follow-up to British Rail's horrific public information film, The Finishing Line. As I mentioned before, they actually had to pull that particular public information film because it was so brutal and so gory that parents complained. And so they pulled it, and it was actually banned for at least 20 years or so. They replaced it, though, because they still wanted a film that, talked about railway safety. And they replaced it with a bit more of a down-to-earth film that's a little less insane, but still does the job, which they called Robbie. Now, Robbie was released in 1979, again, specifically because The Finishing Line had to be pulled. They needed a replacement. British Transport Films still made this, though, but with the specific instructions of, don't murder hundreds of children. It's not necessary to go that far with it. So instead, they decided to go with a bit of a more down-to-earth, like I said, story involving one kid and his failure to adhere to railway safety policies. And it's less gory and brutal and more cripplingly depressing. Now seriously, the film is just sad, just really, really sad. And it does do a good job of hammering home the consequences of playing on railway tracks, which is something I think The Finishing Line kind of failed at. Now it did obviously hammer home the consequences in the form of violent, horrible death, but what if you don't die? Because it is possible to get injured by a train and have to live the rest of your life with some kind of crippling handicap because you were playing on the railway tracks. Robbie decides to go that route. Rather than outright killing a kid, which can do the job in some aspects, they avoided death entirely and focused on the idea of, well, what if they're just injured, like really badly, and they have to live like that forever? You could argue that's almost worse in some ways, and again, it's just depressing, because Robbie, from the get-go, is portrayed as a pretty average kid. He likes soccer, or football, depending on where you're from, the one where you pretty much always kick the ball, that one. Which is a pretty good way to, bring him into ground zero when it comes to what kids in the 1970s and early 80s would be into. Soccer is the most popular sport in the world, and it's insanely popular in the UK. So having a kid who likes soccer and likes trains was probably a good call, because Robbie's also a big fan of trains here. In fact, they use a bunch of stock footage of a bunch of British rail trains, including a steam locomotive, specifically Great Western Railway's number 6000 King George V, which is actually a preserved steam locomotive, just for the record. It also goes on record mentioning how old steam locomotives are and the fact that Robbie's never even seen one, which is hilarious to me, because by this point there were plenty of preservation railroads in the UK. Are you implying that he loves trains, but his mother never took him to a heritage railway at any point? Like, seriously? Mom, what are you doing? Take him to see a steam engine. Do you even love your child? Believe it or not, there's actually 6 different versions of this film. Really? And I'm gonna focus on the original for the sake of my sanity. See, the overall plot of each one is the same and still features Robbie. However, originally in 1979, there were 3 different versions. One was about the dangers of crossing regular railway lines, one was about the dangers of overhead wires, and one was about the dangers of third rail electrified railway lines. The other 3 versions, making a total of 6, are the same, except they swap narrators. See, instead of The Finishing Line, which had a psychopathic kid narrating everything, this time it's just a celebrity they got to do it. In the original's case, it was Peter Purves, who's probably best known for playing a character in the original Doctor Who series. But in 1986, they swapped narrators to make 3 other versions of the film. This time they used Keith Chegwin as the narrator. He was probably best known for Multicolored Swat Shop, which was a children's show that aired in the UK back then. He also did a show called Cheggers Plays Pop. As for the reason of this change, I assume it's because maybe they felt that a generation of kids had already passed by, and Keith might be more readily recognizable to children in 1986, whereas Peter was a bit older, and he may not have been as famous to children at that point as Keith would be. Outside of the narrator change, the films are still basically the same, but because of them already having 3 different versions, that transition means there's 6 different versions. Ugh. But again, for my sanity's sake, the one we're focusing on is the first one from 1979 with Peter, as well as the one that focuses on proper, basic, regular rail safety. No wires or third rail here. And it's also the only one that makes sense to me due to the nature of Robbie's injuries. The other ones, I guess, kinda make sense, but with the way both of them happen, I don't really see how he could have gotten hurt the way he did. But the basic rail one, the one where he just gets run over, literally, I totally believe his injuries, pretty much, in the full scope of things. The film starts off simply enough. We're introduced to both the narrator as well as to Robbie, with a nice shot of a British Intercity 125 passing by, which would have been very popular at the time. Robbie, like I said, is portrayed as kind of an average kid. He has his own interests, he loves soccer, and he also likes trains. He's also a bit of a rambunctious child, and anytime he goes out, he often comes back from sowing the seeds of chaos, thereby increasing his mother's stress levels. Weirdly though, Robbie's also the only one who says don't go on the railway tracks, yet he's the one who gets hurt, but more on that in a second. Anyway, what I think was really cool is the footage they used of the trains during the film. They didn't just utilize one soon-to-be scrapped railway DMU, instead they use a bunch of different ones, showing the different types of trains all over the rail network, including the Intercity 125, a Deltic, and the APT, which surprised me, but at the time this was made, the APT would be being utilized, so it's kinda cool to see. But the actual event that causes all the problems for Robbie is when he's out with his brother and a few friends. The narrator sets it up nice and forebodingly.
Robbie didn't know it, of course, but that was the last goal he'd ever score. Come to that, the last game he'd ever play.
Dun dun dun. Seriously, you didn't have to make it that scary, but okay, I guess this is happening now. His brother Bert says he knows a shortcut to get home, which he does, but the shortcut goes through a broken fence over railway tracks. Robbie says that's a bad idea, and says the kids who broke the fence must be dumb. No, it was a bunch of adults that did it, just to get a shortcut to the pub over there, which, yeah, that sounds like something a bunch of drunks would do. I believe that. During the process, it's revealed that Robbie seems to know more about the railway than anybody else, which makes sense since he likes trains, and points out how dangerous crossing can be. One of the things he mentioned, which floored me, but he's right, is that even if you do hear a train coming and can see it, you won't necessarily be able to hear a second train coming, because the sounds will get mixed up. So let's say one train's coming down one line, but there's another train coming around the corner the other way. You may notice the one, but not the other. Plus, crossing a railway track isn't the same as crossing a road. It's not designed to be walked on. You can slip very easily on the rails, or get your foot stuck. And in fact, the film goes out of its way to mention these various elements during the process to educate kids as to how dangerous and how easy it is to get hurt doing something as simple as crossing the tracks. Because at face value, you'd think, it's fine, I'll just jump over them. What could possibly go wrong? And then you wind up face first in the middle of the rails and run over. And dead, probably. Giving this kind of information out, done in a very, very down-to-earth, actually relatable story way, rather than the psychopathic tendencies of a maniac in the finishing line, I think resonates a bit better, because they still get the point across, but do it in a way that's relatable. It's not some made-up fantasy by a crazy person. This is something that probably has happened before. Some kid says, let's take a shortcut, and the shortcut happens to be over railway lines. I bet you a handful of kids did this exact thing more than once. To, no effect, they probably survived doing it, but they didn't know how dangerous it could be. Naturally, of course, as they're crossing, a train is coming, and Robbie isn't even the kid that trips. It's his friend. Robbie's the one who goes back to help him up, and then he gets his soccer shoes stuck on the rail. And instead of reaching forward and, pulling the shoe, around the rail, Robbie proceeds to just keep tugging on it as if that's going to fix the problem. It's like the one part of the situation where I'm like, okay, Robbie, just pull the shoe around the rail. If you had done that from the get-go, you would still have your feet, is what I'm trying to say. The DMU that runs him over, well, runs him over. There was no way it was going to stop. Robbie attempts to get away after getting his shoes, but his feet are still on the rail when the DMU passes over. You don't actually see what happens. They avoided the gore, but the implication is still there, so it's still fairly effective. Plus, with the girl screaming in response, yeah, I get it. Okay, it was probably gruesome and horrible. The police show up with the brother, who's in a state of shock, and explain to Robbie's mom what happened. She does not take it well, and in fact a big portion of the runtime here is dedicated to showing the effect the accident has on Robbie's family and friends. The girl who screamed is so horrified that she can't speak very well anymore, and is actually hospitalized in some form of shock. Robbie himself, according to the police, loses both his feet, which I believe definitely, but they also say that he breaks half the bones in his body, which seems like an insane exaggeration to scare kids. Like, how did he do that, though? Because I get the feet, definitely. His feet are gone. They were probably sliced completely off. But was he dragged? Like, that's the only thing I could think of, is that somehow he got stuck and he was dragged, which I guess is theoretically possible if the wheel took his leg up into the middle and he got stuck in the axle, which, as I describe it, is just horrible. I'm gonna stop now. I apologize for that one. What do you mean he can't walk? These dang kids are too soft nowadays. I could crush my feet and I'd just walk it off. Glenn, you can't just walk off a foot being cut from your... Yeah, you can. In America, this is a British rail issue. In my rail yard, everyone walks it off. Glenn, no, that is not how that works. What's this sissy doing? Laying in bed all shocked just because you saw someone get hit by a train? I tell you, I've seen plenty of my subordinates murdered, mangled, and wrecked by rail cars because they weren't paying attention or listening to me. And you know what I told them? I told them to walk it off. They were dead, so they couldn't. But that's what I told them. Glenn, please, just, can we get back to filming now? Am I gonna get to crush another limb? Sure, Glenn, whatever. Either way, though, he's horribly injured, like desperately so, and he barely survives and has a permanent disability. He loves soccer still, but he could never play. He's literally wheelchair-bound for the rest of his life because he has no feet. They're gone. And I think that was a really good way to go with the film. Showing a kid that does survive, but has never-ending consequences as a result. This is one of the main things that Robbie loved, and now he can never do it again, and he's not that old. He has to live the rest of his days in a wheelchair and never is able to do the thing he likes to do, all because he chose to cross the railway tracks that day rather than go the long way around like he was supposed to. Had he not listened to his brother and his friend's peer pressure, which is another lesson I think is important for kids, is to not give in to that kind of thing, he would still have his feet, and he would still be playing soccer. And yet, he's not. The film also goes into detail about a lot of other elements, such as getting your foot stuck in switches, which is something no one considers. Those switches, as the film points out, are often moved from miles away without another person being present. So if you're stepping over them and you put your foot there, no one's gonna know that you're stuck. And when a train comes, well, best case scenario, you're saying goodbye to your leg. I think Robbie, at the end of the day, comes across as much better when it comes to giving out information. It's better at telling the story. It's better at explaining to kids why this is bad. Rather than showing a bunch of brutalized children, I mean, that can work in terms of scare tactics, like the finishing line did. Robbie not only shows the consequences of the action, but explains why in a much better, more concise, reasonable way than the finishing line did. So it's definitely a suitable replacement and an improvement, which would explain why it's remained in circulation and even was updated in 1986 for this purpose. British Transport Films did a good job with Robbie. They listened to the criticism when it came to the finishing line and delivered a film that they could actually utilize. Just to warn anybody though who wants to watch it, it is violently depressing. Like, it's just sad seeing his mother cry, seeing his friends in a state of shock. Like, it's just a sad, sad movie. But it gets the job done. So, there you go. And with that, a special thank you to all my underwater train finders. Thomas Ward, Some Dude 267, Orange Glass, Royal Hudson 2860, Lord Hoff 444, Benjamin Owens, Panzer Kitsun 131-232, Mr. Black Rose, Josh Johnson, Metal for Life Guy, Anzac A1, Arthur Roy, DM Trouble Typhoon, Tommy Rossini, Lord Captain Von Thrust III, Joshua Long, Alaric Jaspers, Brian, Jack Carson's Railroad Videos, Major Klutz, Hayden DeGrow, Master of None, Dr. Racer 78, Crystal Morgan, Ohio Trucker 1, and Amtrak 2023 Productions. Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fond farewell.